Welcome to How to Become a Production SQL Database Administrator. My name is Raphael. In the next several series of videos, we're going to be talking one of the most important roles that a DBA does, and that is of securing the SQL server and the data within it. One of the most confusing things that most people have understanding in terms of security is understanding the nomenclature, such as what is a Windows user, what is a SQL login, what is an SQL user. And when we talk about mapping the domain users to logins, it gets quite confusing. So I'm going to try to make it very clear as to what each category of user is. What is a domain user? What is a SQL login? And what is a SQL user? So what I'm going to illustrate to you is beginning with what is a domain. So imagine now that this, let's take this here. So imagine now this is a domain. And in that domain, you've got this one big server computer. And this server is usually called the domain controller, or we'll call it DC. It has a database called Active Directory. Now this Active Directory and this domain controller, it, for our purposes, manages all the users. So anytime there's a domain user here inside, it's controlled by this server. So now that you have this domain, you have a computer, the domain controller, and let's say user 1 comes to work and he wants to work. And then user 2, and we have user 3. So these 3 employees come to work for you. The first thing you're going to do, obviously, is you're going to allow them to go to their computers and start their work. But before they can log on, as you know, they must have an account to log on to that computer. And that's called a Windows domain user. So the network admin is going to go to this computer and he's going to create an account for user 1. And usually it's followed by domain. So let's call this a DBA domain. So it's DBA / whatever the username is. And then he's going to create another user account for DBA 2, and he's going to create another account, DBA user 3. So now these three employees are now part of the network and part of the domain, and they can go to their respective computers and log on using their network user accounts. So this is what's referred to as a network user account. So now imagine now there's another physical computer, and within that physical computer there's an application called SQL. So this is server. This is a server. Let's call this server number 1. Remember, this is a domain controller. This is a DC. And this is another computer or a server called server 1. And within that, it has SQL application. So now these users, user 1, user 2, user 3, they're in this domain, they're doing your job. And user 1 says, hey, I'd like to see some of the information that the SQL server has. Well, the first thing he needs to do, even though this server is part of the domain, this computer is part of the domain, this user, if he wants to access the computer, he can, meaning the server. He can use his Windows domain account, DBA /UA, and he can enter that server. So now he's here. So he's entered within the domain, he's entered that physical server. So, but now the question is, he wants to access the SQL application on that server. So if he's got an account, if he's called DBA user 1, and he wants to access that account or that server called SQL server, he cannot just simply access that server. SQL server will prohibit him from coming there. In order for him to have access to that physical server, we have to give him what's called an SQL login. So now SQL login, or the SQL administrator, will say, hey, I understand UA, you want to come into the SQL server and you want to look at some of the data and look on some of our databases. And he's going to say yes. So what the SA or the system admin on the SQL administration is going to say, okay, that's fine. I'll create you a login. So they go into SQL server, and now they create what's called a login, an SQL login. Now, because this UA user is part of the DBA domain, he can access the entire server, physical server, that is the computer, by himself by authenticating using this authentication, which is Windows authentication. So now he's in the server, but remember, he has not accessed the SQL server or SQL computer. So the SA says, okay, in order for you to access this physical box, if you will, of SA account, I'm going to create you a login, and usually the logins are the same name. So this SQL login is going to be called 1. So now this is an SQL login with the same name, but he's mapped it, and this is what we're talking about, mapping. We're basically saying this DBA/UA Windows domain account has been mapped to this new SQL login account. And now he can access, we've been granted this access, now he can get into the physical box of the server. But as you know now that he's into the server itself, as you know, there are databases. Even though he has a SQL login, that is the same name as U1, even though we've mapped it to the Windows username, he cannot access the databases. He can just get into the physical server itself. In order for him to now access the databases, we have to do one more thing. We have to take this login account now, and we have to create what's called an SQL user. So just like we mapped it here, we now have to map the SQL login to a new user under the same name, and now it's going to be called UA1 user, but we don't call it user, it's just a user. So SQL server has a login called U1. It enters the SQL server. In order for him to access the databases or database, the SA administrator takes the login and creates a user, and then that user SQL login now can enter that database. But within that database, and I'm being very granular here deliberately, so within that database now there are what's called tables or objects, as you know. So we've got table 1, table 2, table 3, table 4. So can that user now, who has access to the database, he's got in that side, does he have access to these objects called table? And the answer is no. In order for us to give to that SQL user who's accessed the database access to these tables, we control that by what's called permissions. And then we can grant permissions to individual tables or all the tables. And we can be as granular as we want. And if we want to, for example, give him access to only one table, then when he gets to that database, he will only be able to view that table. If we want him to view only table 3 and not these, then we can grant him viewable access to table 3. So as you can see, and we can even go further here, we can even actually be more granular and say, okay, you can see table 3, but in that table 3 there's column 1, there's column 2, column 3, and we can say we don't want you to say, so let's say this is social security number, this is salary, this is phone number, this is first name, last name. So we don't want him to give social security. So we can even granularly control the security and say, we don't want you to see this social security number, but the rest of the fields or columns you can. So as you can see, SQL Server is quite granular in its security. So let me quickly illustrate one more thing what we've discussed so far. And let's look at a new one here. Don't save. So I'm just going to repeat quickly what we went through. So we have a domain. In that domain, there is a server called domain controller. As users come in, they can do their work in that domain. If within that domain there's another server or another computer that has SQL Server, if any of these users want to access that computer, that physical server, then through Windows authentication, they can get in to that server, but not SQL. If they want to get into the SQL, then the SA administration will create a login first. So you need an SQL login for this guy. Once he's entered the SQL login, or the SQL server itself, he needs to access the database. Within that databases, let's call these databases, within this next tier of databases, if he wants to actually get into that databases, then we take that SQL login and we map it and we create what's called a user. Now the user can access this database. Once the user, which is now U1, can access that database, he still needs permissions to grant to tables. So now these are table level 2 to 3. We can give him specific permissions to view and select various tables. Within that, we can become even more granular and say, yes, you can view that table, but within that table, we can only give you access to column 1, column 2, and column 3. And that's it, of the various columns. So as you can see, there's a very, very important aspect or understanding how SQL manages security right from what's called the Windows server, a Windows user. Then if he comes in and he needs to be mapped, we have to create him an SQL login. And then if that SQL login wants to enter the database, then we have to create an SQL user. And then once the SQL user gets access to the database and tables and columns, we can control that security. So we can be very granular here. So this is how the principle of security works in SQL administration. And I'm going to be illustrating that in the next video, so we'll get a better understanding. So I hope that made it a little more clear as to the roles of what a Windows user is, how he's translated or made into what's called an SQL login, and then once you have an SQL login, then you need to create an SQL user to access databases. And once I illustrate this, it'll be a little easier. So I think I'm going to leave it here because I don't want to get a little too confusing. But the next video I think will hopefully make this even more clear. So my name is Rafael, and this is how to become a production SQL database administrator. See you in the next video.